Hey everyone, and welcome to Storey Building, the storytelling podcast about storytellers and the stories that they tell us. I'm joined by Seth Hynes, Australian author and writer. Hey Seth, how you going?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Great. Well, I brought you on here to talk about your history as a writer, but most importantly, the two books that you have written, Trans-Sentient and The Coded Heirs. So could you give us a quick or long, or however long you want, synopsis on these two books of what got you into writing and why you wrote them?
Sure. Well, both books are in the cyberpunk subgenre, and that's a subgenre of science fiction that I've enjoyed for a long time. I'd say I was my first like clear experience of cyberpunk was probably the Ghost in the Shell TV show during high school. But I did actually play an old video game called Shadow Wraith on my nana's ancient computer, and that was probably my true first experience of cyberpunk. But uh, the first book, like Trans-Sentient, is a short story collection. I've always loved writing, and particularly writing short stories. I haven't read much Stephen King novels, many Stephen King novels, but I've read a lot of his short stories. Same with Clive Barker and Arthur C. Clarke. I've been writing short stories since like mid high school at least, and it felt great to write a series of short stories that are mostly self-contained, but have certain recurring technologies and concepts, and in certain cases, some recurring characters. And it kind of felt in a way like I remember one person I spoke to about it sort of compared the book to almost like compared it to Black Mirror in a way. And The Coded Heirs, as I say in the book, it's probably the most fulfilling big project I've ever written, because not only is it another short, not a short fiction, but certainly shorter than a novel. It's a novella in the first half, but it's something I really loved building, and I loved expanding the world I built in Trans-Sentient with these new characters, and I grew really attached to these new characters. But the essay collection might be a bit pretentious to call it sort of autobiographical, but it did. It was really thrilling to explore so many of my interests. Uh, Again, like cyberpunk, how it may reflect on the real world, not just in fiction. Cosmology, certain areas of philosophy, deconstruction, concepts of artificial intelligence. I loved exploring those in the essay section. The Coded Heirs was a great opportunity to explore my interests not only in like through fiction, but through non-fiction as well, with the two kind of commenting on each other.
You mentioned cyberpunk before. When
Mhm.
I think cyberpunk, I just think, oh yeah, Blade Runner. And I don't really have any
Mm.
explanation as to why I think Blade Runner is cyberpunk. It's just what I've always associated with that word. And in The Coded Heirs, you mentioned you talk about post-cyberpunk. Could you just explain to me, who knows nothing, what cyberpunk is and what post-cyberpunk is?
Yeah, well, cyberpunk is, and it's very fair for you to immediately think of Blade Runner when you think of cyberpunk, as Blade Runner certainly. Like, I don't really like Blade Runner all that much. I love the
Ooh,
sequel,
I don't mind.
Blade
It's fine.
20, but Blade Runner definitely established the aesthetic of cyberpunk. You know, Nearly every cyberpunk piece of cyberpunk media looks like, in some way, looks like Blade Runner. Like, since that film came out, like nearly every cyberpunk media looks like Blade Runner. But cyberpunk, you can think of it as a combination of high tech with low life. So
Ah, okay.
cyber often deals with tropes or or concepts of virtual reality, like cyberspace, so the internet as like a landscape, not just a network, artificial intelligence, even genetic engineering, combined with sort of noirish concepts. Many cyberpunk protagonists are like they do tilt toward classic sort of noir crime thriller characters. Like a lot of cyberpunk protagonists are, say, petty criminals or assassins, or well, that they're hackers, which is in a way a sort of modern version of like the career. Well, in some ways, it is like a modern version of the sort of career criminal. Like cyberpunk often has a lot of organized crime in it. So yeah, it's a combination of really advanced technology with sort of like the grungy underbelly of society.
Mm.
And with post-cyberpunk, I think I mainly discussed that in the like afterwards to Trans-Sentient. To me, like, well, post-cyberpunk, as I understand it, it's basically a version or an offshoot itself of cyberpunk that presents, I suppose, a more plausible version of like a technological, like hyper technological future. Like cyberpunk is nearly always varying levels of dystopian. Like, in Blade Runner, Los Angeles is like just grimy and drenched with rain, and a giant corporation is basically bioengineering slaves. That's extremely dystopian. But in cyberpunk, post-cyberpunk, society generally it's still shown to have degraded in as many ways as it's evolved and advanced, but it's not as oppressive. Like, it's not as dystopian as classic cyberpunk. But I feel post-cyberpunk, it's sort of kind of a redundant term. Like, I've watched, like in the cyberpunk I've watched and read, even in many dystopian, like clearly dystopian examples, there's still positive aspects to society. Like, there's still genuine human connection, even between individuals you might think of as extremely far removed from humanity, from all the technology they've integrated into themselves. So I feel, post-cyberpunk is sort of unnecessary, because to me, cyberpunk it just on its, like, as a term in itself, encompass, the hardline dystopia and sort of more positive, hopeful, realistic visions of the future as well.
Yeah, when I was reading both of your books, I was, well, actually more so with Trans-Sentience, the first one, there was always a moment for the first, I'd say, a quarter of it, where I was waiting for the futuristic dystopian horror to kick in. But I was so shocked by how lovely it was. I like that. I was expecting it to be so much more sterile. I think my favorite short story in that short story collection is the one where this boy finds this girl, and she's got like a robot leg, and they go out and they watch movies like through a USB in the leg, and then they go back to her place, and he essentially, well, he has sex with her leg. And while reading this, I was thinking, okay, when is the leg going to like get a mind of its own and come alive and kill everyone? But it never happened. It was such a lovely story, and I was so pleasantly surprised by the pleasantness. Was it always an intention to make these futuristic stories, which could very easily have been, robots take over the world and kill everyone? Was it always the intention to make it nice?
I don't think I had intentions that that crystal clear through developing the book. But I did get a lot of satisfaction out of building this sort of conspiracy narrative throughout Trans-Sentient, and like seeding details for this conspiracy to be overthrown. Like conspiracy is actually another big element in cyberpunk. Like probably the most famous example would be how, from what I remember, in Neuromancer, which is basically the literary genesis of cyberpunk, published in, I think, the late 70s, various various entities, including a big corporation, are, I think, conspiring to merge two artificial intelligences together, one of which is named Neuromancer. They are, manipulating and exploiting various other groups to achieve, including the protagonist, who is, again, a sort of down on his luck drug-taking hacker. So again, a noirish character. They are manipulating these groups to achieve their goal. So I did really enjoy ultimately building to basically a happy ending in a way. So it wasn't a drive from the very start, but I was glad to end up there, you could say. And also, I'm glad you really enjoyed the sort of romance story in the book. Probably the story I'm the least happy with nowadays.
That one,
Mainly
the one with the robot leg, the robot leg lady.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
mainly
Well,
because you've read the essay, male gaze mea culpa in the Coded Heirs, right? I do address in that how I don't like how I don't like in hindsight how the narrator does approach the female main character when she is in a somewhat vulnerable state. And
I believe that they're are they at like a public pool and she's in a swimsuit?
Yeah.
Right.
And I feel, of course, there are a lot of women like every day who have to deal with unwanted advances from men who take their who are drawn to them. And while, of course, she has most of the agency in this growing relationship, or in these interactions, and she is happy to interact with the guy, I don't really feel good through that story in kind of continuing to enable that kind of unwanted, or that in many cases unwanted, out of the blue interaction. Do you know what I mean?
I thought that her confidence in the story, I thought that she was essentially leading the relationship. Like he instigated
Sure.
them talking to each other, but I got the impression that she was essentially in charge, because he felt kind of awkward with the fact that she had an artificial leg going on, but she was fine with it. She didn't seem vulnerable or taken aback or uncomfortable with the fact that someone was curious about it. I think that made her quite powerful in the narrative, that she sort of owned every situation.
That's a good point. Well,
Great.
thank you for giving me some opportunity to reassess my own story.
Well, I liked it. I liked the sweetness. I liked the romance. It's funny because I was expecting, horrible robot people to kill everyone.
That does happen.
Yeah. Yes, it does. Yeah. I was happy to read that, but it was that too was a bit of a shock after all the nice stories. So I've got a little bit of a quote here from one of your stories in Trans-Sentience. I think it's the one that's actually called Trans-Sentience, where Shannon, I believe, the woman who's a robot but doesn't want to be thought of as a robot. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, the identity human.
Yeah,
title refers to, like characters who are organic or digital or some combination of both, identifying as different levels on that sort of spectrum.
Right. Okay. Well, she is in this part of the story, in that short story, she's giving a speech to the world about her opinions on Asimov's three laws and how she wants to, or just her opinions on herself in the world. If you don't mind, I'd like to read out a part of her speech, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Right, cool.
Go ahead.
So she says to the world, if digital minds like mine are equal in sentience and intelligence to the human benchmark, then doesn't that make us human? Aren't we a part of that benchmark now? And since nearly all digital minds are sort of reverse engineered from pre-existing human minds, then doesn't that further make us just like you? I identify as human. It's how I feel inside, whatever I'm made of. Of course, so many other digital minds do not identify as human. They call themselves droids, artificial persons, or SBs, and that's great too. But if we're just like you, then isn't it crazy that we're forced to follow Asimov's laws, but you're not? I mean, of course, I don't want to hurt anybody unless in self-defense. Of course, I want to be a stable, contributing member of society and follow orders when I think they're right, but I want a choice. You have it, so we should too. Now, is that literally what you believe and what you would say in that situation, or did you have to change a bit of your own opinions on what she's talking about to suit that specific character?
No, it does. Well, it does reflect how I feel about human rights in a broad sense, and Asimov's laws in particular. You know, Isaac Asimov's three laws of robotics were a huge influence. Mainly the first book, to a lesser extent the second book. But
could you just go over those three laws right now?
Sure. They were introduced in like the late 40s to the early 50s by Isaac Asimov. Law 1 states that a robot must not harm another a human being, or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Law 2 states that a robot must follow a human's commands unless those commands would result in harm to a human. And Law 3 states that a robot must protect its own existence unless that self-protection would result in harm to a human or disobeying a command.
Right. I first heard of those, saw those in the Will Smith I, Robot movie, which I'm sure you would agree is a very faithful adaptation of Asimov's ideas.
Well, it does actually have some clever ideas about like the short story, like that short story collection to film. I think it's a decent action movie anyway. But with Asimov's laws, before starting work on Trans-Sentient, I came to feel that while they are great storytelling tools, and Asimov did a great job of kind of logically pushing the laws in a lot of fanciful scenarios and showing how in certain situations they can break down or go kind of buggy. Like I remember one story in iRobot about a robot that's essentially drunk, like acting like it's drunk, because some sort of imbalance in how closely it follows each law results in it kind of unable to help the main characters survive, like on Mercury, like as their base starts to overheat. So but unable to leave and protect itself because it would result in harm to them. So this kind of imbalance in how it follows law 1 and 3 sort of, basically makes it drunk, and it just keeps running around the crater, unable to help. And but yeah, I feel that while Asimov's laws are great storytelling tools, they are, or well, they would be very unethical if applied to an entity that has, true consciousness. I don't think any entity should be cognitively forced to follow, follow any kind of moral directive. We should, in all circumstances, learn how to behave morally and genuinely want to behave that way. We shouldn't have, mental blockers in our heads that prevent us from, say, harming a human under any circumstance, even if it is for, say, self-defense. And yeah, if Asimov's laws were instituted in or applied in the real world, I would be against it, even though I do enjoy writing about them.
Discussions like this really, really freak me out, because I think that for most people, when they think of the future and the future of robotics, they essentially just think of a Roomba that sort of walks like the Tin Man from the Wizard of Oz. I don't think most people, even though this is in stuff like Blade Runner, I don't think people really think of synthetic people as someone who in any way that a human can see acts just like a person. I think that's going to be the most interesting thing that's going to happen in, I'd say, the next maybe even less than 100 years, where we create synthetic people that, and of course these discussions are going to come up. Should they be treated like everyone else? Because the big difference between a person and a person that a person creates is that the person that the person creates knows where they came from, where with humans we just go, oh, we were just sort of farted out from the universe by accident and we don't really know. But I mean, does this stuff scare you? Even though your stories are quite utopian, do you think that we're headed for a utopian robotic synthesis in the future? Please say yes.
Well, I hope so. Although my one perspective, well, a perspective of mine that has changed the most since I released The Coded Heirs and Trans-Sentient is probably that I'm not sure if we ever will develop true artificial consciousness. We are developing computer systems and neural networks that, eerily approximate thought in many ways. There are AI networks that can make decent poetry or artwork or even music. But someone I follow on Twitter observed that, at least with foreseeable technology, like technology we can foresee in the next few decades, even if it advances quite far from where we are now, you would still need like enormous, huge, like servers to replicate the thought, like intricate thought processes, or something equivalent to them in a human brain.
Oh yeah.
We would essentially go back to computers the size of buildings, like we had to make, or like to in our attempts to make artificial consciousness. I certainly think it is actually possible to make artificial consciousness, in that, I think most people would agree that there are a lot of animals that are to some degree conscious. So life has evolved consciousness in very different ways, like conceivably dozens of different ways over the past 550 million years of complex life. But I'm not sure, so I don't think that rules out humans or creating a synthetic version. But I'm sort of doubtful now as to whether we will achieve it, sadly.
Sadly?
Yeah, because it would. I think it would be. It would be very exciting if we did indeed create machines that can genuinely think and feel for themselves. And I
So,
think, if we guided them, well, with respect and compassion, and I think we must do that if we create such beings, then we wouldn't see, we likely wouldn't see a Terminator style uprising of the, rise of the machines, quote unquote.
hmm. You said
You know,
that there are robots that can uh, make poetry and music, and there was for quite a time I was quite happy in my creative endeavors,
mhm.
knowing that a robot couldn't show up and write a play or write music. So how do you feel as a writer, someone who is engaging in a creative, artistic uh, activity, knowing that your job could be made obsolete in the same way that a truck driver's job could be made obsolete?
Well, I would think, just as different humans have, well, different humans trained in writing or art have different styles within those fields, and therefore different audiences. I'm pretty sure that would apply to artificial consciousnesses too. You know, as they develop, we may result well, we may find, artificial consciousnesses that think more diversely and more like us. Like, they might not think like us at the start, but they might think more like us in the future. But I think, based on that, well, diversity of thought that should arise in artificial consciousness, if we ever make it, we would still have, areas where certain artificial people would make better art than some real people, but some real people would make better art than some artificial people. Well, I think it's quite possible that if we develop artificial consciousness, there would eventually be, some that are talented and some that are not. Just like some of us are talented.
Oh,
Do you see what I'm?
yeah, I guess any machine can only be as good as it's programmed to become, and because individual people have individual skills, those machines will do individual things to an individual skill level. I
Mm-hmm.
think possibly. So, what kind of advice would you give to people who would like to write science fiction? And on top of that, what do you think of the future of not just science fiction writing, but writing in general, in a world where everything is becoming very recorded, and there's a lot of surveillance going on? How can you write a story where a villain exists or a hero has to overcome some massive struggle in a world that's becoming safer and safer and more technologically all encompassing?
Hmm. Well, as for writing science fiction, you should, well, I would say read it as much as you can. Because, science fiction is wonderful, and there's so much varied sci-fi content out there. But if you're interested in writing science fiction, you probably read it already. I would also say, if you want to get into writing science fiction, certainly, well, go for it, and don't let yourself be discouraged. Like I have in trying to sell my books in the past, I have received some degree of, well, not disdain, but, well, the genre I write for has received quite a bit of disdain from some everyday people who don't read or watch science fiction. It is in many circles still viewed, excuse me, as kind of a juvenile genre, and I think that's quite unjust. But if you love science fiction and want to write it, you go ahead and sort of essentially prove them wrong.
I think kids just like robots and spaceships and lasers.
Yeah, but you can write those maturely as well,
Mm.
and people do. Um, but as for how, like, you wanted to know how we can continue to write good stories in worlds that are like safer and have less threat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I would say, like, even in pretty calm lives, there's still pathos and conflict emerging, even just in how effectively you can solve a problem or work through a relationship. So that's, on a personal, like an intimate drama level. But yeah, even if the world is getting safer, there's still stories to be mined from how that safety might fail. And of course, there's well, historical fiction. And it's kind of funny. Like, I read a tweet around a week ago from an author I follow, and she observed how she was kind of floored when she had to, I think she's also an editor, she had to edit or look through a manuscript. It was framed as historical fiction, but it's set in 1994. And, I was
Oh,
3 in 1994. But, in some ways, 1994 is a very different era from now.
and
And, well,
we're getting close to a tidal wave of nostalgic TV and movies, because we're sort of at the 80s Stranger Things kind of point.
yeah.
In a couple of
Mhm.
years, there's going to be a lot of 90s stuff, a lot of Super Mario 64 going on.
Well, I was under the impression we sort of should have already gotten a lot of the 90s nostalgia. Like,
Mm.
nostalgia tends to operate in like 2 decades. So, like, in the 70s, we had a lot of 50s nostalgia.
Mhm.
Uh, in like the 80s, we had a lot of 60s nostalgia. In the 90s, we had a lot of 70s. The 2000s was chock full of 80s nostalgia.
Oh yeah,
So, really, ends should have been the 90s nostalgia
yeah. We're
decade.
we're at the early
But
2000s point
yeah,
now.
doing my
They've skipped it.
mm,
Damn it.
yeah. but but yeah, the science fiction can certainly take place in the past. Like, it can present alternate presents, or inject sci-fi tropes in clever ways into the past. Um, like, one of my favorite novels is The Time Ships by Stephen Baxter. It's actually an authorized sequel to H.G. Wells's The Time Machine, and it takes place across multiple different timelines, um, created by the protagonist's intervention at various points, usually unwitting, in the past. And say one part takes place in an altered, I think, 1930s, with strong influence from like War of the Worlds.
Would you call
And
something like Bioshock science fiction, where it's like the past, but like a different kind of steampunky past?
yeah, I would consider Bioshock science fiction, definitely.
All right.
Uh, there's one of my other favorite novels is Illusion by Paula Volsky. It's mostly a fantasy novel, and I'm personally not really that into fantasy. I've always preferred science fiction, but it's a brilliant retelling, essentially a brilliant retelling of the French Revolution, including the charged social, upheaval, like social politics and upheaval of the era, but with magic. But it also has some degree of like techno fantasy to it. Probably techno fantasy is my favorite kind of fantasy, because it has sci-fi elements. So Dishonored is a good example. But in Illusion, the main villain preserve like secures his rule using essentially these like magic robots which enforce his rule over the city or the former kingdom of Vonar in various ways. Like one of them is basically sort of like a nanotech machine composed of millions of tiny like beetle robots. And this
like Samurai Jack.
I'm afraid
so sorry. Well, yeah, there's bug robots in that. I just thought of that just then. Sorry, go on.
Like the Gort in the Day the Earth Stood Still remake. Although I like the remake, but the original is better.
Is Gort the Keanu Reeves guy or the visor big robot guy?
Keanu Reeves plays Klaatu.
Right.
Gort is.
Just as a side, just because you brought this up, Klaatu Barada Nikto. What is that? I keep hearing that in like science fiction circles. Klaatu Barada Nikto. What is that?
Well, it's basically an expression the characters use to not disarm, but have Gort stand down. Like Gort I haven't seen the remake in a long time, but in the 1951 original, Gort is essentially Klaatu's robot bodyguard, and he's designed to non-lethally, if possible, defend Klaatu. But even Klaatu fears that if something were to happen to him, Gort would potentially destroy the Earth in retaliation. And that sort of starts to happen when Klaatu is shot again by the military. And the main like one of the main characters is presumably about to be killed by Gort, but she utters that famous phrase Klaatu Barada Nikto to make him stand down.
Oh, there you go. As I mentioned before, there's a lot of pleasantness, a lot of light fun, and there's a lot of there's a big human element in your science fiction stories. And I've got another, not a quote, but like a passage from the Coded Heirs. This is sorry. Which
one is this from?
Coded Heirs.
Oh, sorry. Right. Yes.
This is Tassa and Mimira. They're together in bed, and here we go. Do you want to see how insatiable I am? Tassa whispered huskily. Tassa brought her hand to the inside of Mimira's thigh, giving Mimira a delicious shiver. Tassa slowly slid her hand upward, stopping just short of Mimira's mons pubis. Mons pubis is the volcano on Mars. But still, there was a lot of to put it bluntly, there was a lot of sex scenes in these stories, and I very often when I see sex scenes in anything, it comes off as gratuitous, and it's like, yeah, I get it, they're in love, move on to the next scene. But I found it so necessary in these stories to show how people in a futuristic world who could very easily be separated and just look at each other through screens like what we're doing right now. Was it the intention to add blatant sex scenes to give it that human element?
Well, I don't think it ended up really blatant. They ultimately
it was porn. You write porn, Seth, admit it.
But I did intend to show sex to some degree as just another element of how humans who are close to one another, like humans who are people who are closely connected, keep their bond strong, or how they sort of physically show they are. It's just one way that they show that they're physically show that they are so close. And I did actually make quite a point of not making it titillating. Like it is to an extent explicit, but it's not. I hoped to make it nice to read without being just bluntly pandering. You see what I mean?
Yeah, that's why I liked the story with the artificial leg lady so much, because it was this beautiful melding of technology and sort of human animal instinct, because they used a futuristic thing and an ancient thing for humans, and just they worked together so well. Yeah, I think we're going to get a bit of a renaissance for appreciation for human talent, because it'll eventually just become quite rare, or rather like physical talent, or really any sort of skill that a person can work hard on achieving.
And we are a little bit, in a way, given, for instance, the continuing backlash, in a sense, or resistance to CGI in movies. There are people who argue that practical effects are always better, but as the Corridor crew stated at one point, it's not really that simple. Practical effects, while they do actually have a clear sense of well, they are indeed a physical thing on set interacting with the actors. You have to essentially build them to the set, and they only look good under certain angle, like certain lighting and in certain angles. And like CGI can be amazing at building extremely intricate, convincing worlds, and it's getting a lot better creating photorealistic living characters. But in many ways, the best effects can be, a combination of CGI and practical. In many cases, you'll get great effects that are, like practical, real sets and props, but augmented with CGI.
Yeah.
So
what movie did that pretty well and still holds up to this day? Star Wars: The Phantom Menace. Compare the Phantom Menace to Attack of the Clones. The Phantom Menace looks better because they used practical things and then enhanced them with CGI. And then compare that to Attack of the Clones. We've got Obi-Wan walking in a green plastic, not even there kind of room. The pod race still holds up.
Yeah, it does. And like, many of the sets in Phantom Menace were real.
Yeah.
Actually, I think Hayden Christensen himself said that he remembers only being in one real set during all of his scenes.
And it was all green. So what are your current projects? What are you working on right now?
Well, I'm still working on my weekly film review column for the Star Mail newspaper. Funnily enough, last year, of course, cinemas in Victoria were closed from roughly March to November. And there was a brief closure in what was it? I think April or May. Again, it's a bit hard to keep track of time in the pandemic world now. But I did receive an email from the sub-editor at the time stating that due to the pandemic, the smaller paper, due to less advertising and the priority on, pandemic-related articles, they may not be able to run my film review column. And of course, cinemas were closed, so it was in a way less relevant. But I was still able to review movies every week for the newspaper, simply by they welcomed me to shift my focus, of course, to Netflix and streaming movies.
Yeah, of course. Do you think that there's a future for live entertainment, or just going out to a movie theater? Do you think movie theaters or theaters in general are going to go the blockbuster way?
I hope not. And well, theaters haven't. Live plays are still very frequently staged, including in my hometown. So I certainly hope cinemas don't go extinct, but they are, as we can see, slowly losing relevance. Like I believe Godzilla versus Kong, for instance, was I believe released simultaneously in cinemas and streaming.
I
Um,
watched it in the cinemas. It was
but
incredible. I was blown right out of my seat.
hmm, I think it's a bit like its predecessor in that this is becoming a cliche, but the human characters were very bland
Mm.
and
Yeah,
but the monster action was amazing, and there was a
yeah,
lot of it.
and it wasn't always at night in the rain.
Yeah, or in snow in the Arctic.
Yeah, yeah,
And I remember that Tenet, a huge deal was made about Tenet being released exclusively to cinemas, like never, or not never, but it's not going to be released on streaming before its time. And it turned out it wasn't even very good.
yeah. I saw it. I didn't know what was going on. What's weird is that when I try to think about what was happening in Inception, I feel smarter for it. When I think about what was happening in Tenet, I feel stupider for it. I feel like I'm wasting my time trying to figure out what was happening.
But yeah, so I think, well, given the survival of theaters through the centuries, I would hope that reflects well on the survival of the cinema into the future. Um, Although you do hear about successful cinema debuts, movie debuts in cinemas. They're described as successful, but they're a lot lower than they used to be. So
Yeah,
it is quite possible cinemas may not go extinct, but they might become more of a niche thing. So I don't think
yeah.
they'll go the way of but it's possible they might become um, sort of a special thing you don't have in many places. But
Yeah, apparently there was a play that was going on either in America or England, I believe, called The Mousetrap, and apparently it was the
hmm,
longest running play of all time. I think it ran consistently for at least 50 years, and in 2020 it finally had to stop. It was such a tragedy.
hmm, that sounds interesting. Well, that almost sounds like a sort of intergenerational production in a way. That makes sense.
Oh, so
Like,
like different of course someone can't play a role for 50 years on stage, maybe. I mean Harrison Ford sort of proven us wrong, but still, yeah, I mean it's the production was going for over 50 years, and yeah, the plague 2.0 finally took it down. I think it's back up and running now, but still, like, so sad, such a tragedy.
I remember learning a little while ago that what we think of as a book these days, as a standard book, originally it was referred to as a codex. Um,
Fancy.
Before, yeah, but before then, books, quote unquote, existed more in the form of like rolls of parchment in a way, or like um, or tablets, things like that. But yeah, a code like the codex, what we think of now as a regular book, it has existed for centuries upon centuries, and I certainly hope it. But again, I don't think physical books will ever go extinct. They may again dwindle in relevance, kind of like DVDs are, but I don't think they ever go away.
I think
They
the best books that are ever written are ones that aren't really that uh, new, because the technology doesn't change as drastically. I mean, as much as many people might disagree with me, I'd say that technically the best movie ever made has probably come out in the past maybe 15 years, but the best book could be 50 years old, because
Mhm.
it isn't being superseded by any sort of fancy technology that makes it better.
I could see that. Like, have you read any Kurt Vonnegut?
Never heard of that person.
Really?
No,
Have you
sorry.
uh, Slaughterhouse Five?
Slaughterhouse Five?
Yep.
That sounds familiar, but I don't know what that is. What is that?
But Kurt Vonnegut was a famous American author, and well, he was a POW during World War II, and that, of course, informed many of his books. But Slaughterhouse Five is a brilliant, and as is often the case with Kurt Vonnegut, very funny science fiction novel about a man whose mind is unstuck in time. So his mind often randomly moves backward and forward in time to, for instance, when he was a POW in World War II, to his present life as a successful dentist, to his time as an alien zoo exhibit in the future,
Mhm.
and to his own death. So he keeps reliving his life uncontrollably all throughout his existence. Um, it's one of my favorite books and films, but probably my favorite Vonnegut novel is Cat's Cradle, which is again a hilarious and extremely vivid, efficiently written. Like Kurt Vonnegut is very efficient with his prose. It's about an allegory about the end of the world, commenting on the psychological effect of the atomic bomb on its creators and the people it was used upon, and applying that to a strange new technology. But that book was published in, I think, the early 50s, but it still feels very, very accessible, due in large part to Vonnegut's, again, very, very simple but powerful prose. But also, it doesn't it doesn't make reference to any particularly outdated technology. While it does clearly take place in the 50s, it it doesn't feel remote. It still comments on real issues of humans moving toward their own destruction, and it still touches upon very real human emotion and very real human feeling and experience that can happen at any time in history. So I think you're right. How many media works of media are probably the most enduring when they're not, they don't sort of tie themselves to any particular era.
So the final question that I have to ask is, for you as a writer personally, why do you think that stories and telling stories is important?
Well, telling stories allows us to, express our thoughts on the world and comment upon it, but also, especially in the case of science fiction, envision possible futures and new worlds, and therefore new forms humanity can take, and indeed different versions of ourselves. It is a form, as fiction, and in many ways, especially science fiction, is certainly a form of escapism. But it is a way, it is also to an extent aspirational. At least the more utopian leaning forms of science fiction, they do present visions of forms of the future, versions of the future we can either reach toward, or forms that we really should try our hardest not to get to, or not to create. So yeah, I think fiction is very important for allowing us to express ourselves and create and aspire toward new forms for ourselves and the world.
Right. Until the robots take over and then kill all of us, right?
Yeah. I hope if we treat them right, they don't.
Okay, great.
And I feel sort of contradicting myself a little bit in that I've written 2 books in which I'm very passionate about rights for artificial consciousnesses, and yet I've sort of come to believe that I'm sort of doubtful we'll ever actually achieve them. I'm sorry to say.
Well, surely it's a good thought experiment.
Of course.
Experiment for people, and just a reminder as to how we should treat everyone and everything.
Yeah, it's still a good way of addressing how we should treat people who are different from us but fundamentally equal to us. So yeah, you're right.
Oh, great. All right. Well, Seth, thank you so much for coming here and talking about your mind and everything, all the things that you write. We should maybe do this later when your next book comes out. I'll bring you back.
I would love that.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, I'll talk to you later then.
Talk to you then.